Hey everyone! Tonight we delve into the shadow depths of one of the most complex and enigmatic figures in all of Star Wars lore. The story of Kreia, the woman who would become Darth Traya, whose ultimate ambition was not to rule the galaxy, but to commit the most impossible act ever conceived to murder the Force itself. Now, before we begin this epic journey, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I've noticed that about 86% of you watching regularly haven't subscribed yet, and honestly, your subscription is what keeps this channel alive and allows me to bring you these deep dives into the stories we all love. Also, if you're fascinated by tales of political intrigue and betrayal, you'll definitely want to check out my brand new channel, The Raven's Tales, where I explore the dark and twisted world of Game of Thrones. I've added the link right there in the description below. I'm genuinely curious to know where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop a comment and let me know, because there's something magical about knowing we're all sharing this story together, no matter how far apart we might be. Now, get comfortable, dim those lights, and let's journey together into a tale that spans decades of manipulation, betrayal, and philosophical awakening. In the crumbling stone corridors of Malachor V, an old woman stood before her former student, her eyes burning with terrible knowledge. "You were meant to be my greatest failure," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of a lifetime's bitter wisdom. Around them, the dark side saturated every stone, every breath, every heartbeat. But this was not the end of her story. This was merely the culmination of a plan so audacious, so utterly impossible, that it would reshape the very nature of existence itself. How had Kreia, once a respected Jedi Master, fallen so far that she would seek to destroy the very foundation of life in the galaxy? What drove this brilliant teacher to betray everything she once held sacred? And why did she believe that the greatest act of mercy she could perform would be to free all living beings from the Force's eternal manipulation? The answers lie buried in decades of carefully orchestrated deception, in lessons taught through pain, and in a philosophy so dangerous that both Jedi and Sith would unite to stop her if they truly understood what she intended to accomplish. To understand the woman who would become Darth Traya, we must first step into the galaxy as it existed in those turbulent times, nearly 4,000 years before the rise of the Empire. This was the era of the Old Republic, when the Jedi Order stood at the height of its power and influence, yet carried within itself the seeds of its own destruction. The Republic stretched across countless star systems, its golden age slowly giving way to the shadows of approaching war. On Coruscant, the towering spires of the Jedi Temple reached toward the clouds, housing thousands of Jedi Knights and Masters who served as guardians of peace and justice. Within those hallowed halls, among the most respected teachers of the Order, was a woman known simply as Kreia. Master Kreia was not like other Jedi, where her peers sought harmony and consensus. She thrived on challenging comfortable assumptions. Her reputation as a teacher was both revered and controversial, for she believed that true wisdom could only emerge through struggle, through questioning everything one had been taught to accept without examination. Her students were not merely trained in lightsaber combat and force techniques, they were forged in the fires of philosophical debate and moral complexity. The Academy, on Dantooine, with its crystal caves and rolling grasslands, became her preferred teaching ground. Here, away from the rigid protocols of the Coruscant Temple, Kreia could shape young minds in ways that would have made the more traditional masters deeply uncomfortable. She taught that the Force was not the benevolent guide that Jedi doctrine proclaimed, but something far more complex and potentially dangerous. To her students, she posed questions that had no easy answers. If the Force guides all things, what room is there for free will? If we are all connected through this cosmic energy, are we truly individuals or merely puppets dancing to a greater design? Among her most promising students were two young men whose names would echo through galactic history, Revan and Alec, who would later take the name Malachor. Revan possessed a brilliant strategic mind and an insatiable curiosity about the nature of the Force itself. He questioned everything, much like his teacher, but where Kreia's questions led her toward philosophical contemplation, Revan's drove him toward action. Alec was different, passionate and loyal, with a warrior's heart that beat in rhythm with righteous fury. Together they formed the core of a generation of Jedi that Kreia hoped would transcend the limitations she perceived in the Order. But even as she taught them, darker forces were stirring beyond the Republic's borders. The Mandalorian clans, under the leadership of Mandalore the Ultimate, had begun their systematic conquest of worlds along the Outer Rim. These were not mere raiders or pirates, but a warrior culture that had refined the art of war into something approaching religious devotion. Their Beskar armor gleamed like silver death in the light of burning worlds, and their discipline was absolute. The Mandalorian Wars, as they would come to be known, presented the Jedi Order with a terrible dilemma. The Republic's military forces were being systematically dismantled by Mandalorian tactics. Worlds were falling one by one, and millions of innocent beings cried out for salvation. Yet the Jedi Council, led by Master Vrook Lamar and others, chose to wait and meditate, seeking guidance from the Force before committing to action. It was this decision, this moment of hesitation in the face of galactic suffering, that would plant the first seeds of doubt in Kreia's mind about the wisdom of her order. How could beings who claimed to serve justice stand idle while entire civilizations burned? How could the Guardians of Peace justify inaction when their intervention could save countless lives? The political landscape of the Republic itself was fracturing under the strain. Chancellor Tol Kreia struggled to maintain unity among systems that questioned whether the Republic could truly protect them. Some worlds began to consider surrender to the Mandalorians rather than face complete destruction. Others looked to the Jedi for salvation that seemed increasingly unlikely to come. In the Senate chambers on Coruscant, debates raged day and night. Senator after senator rose to demand action, to plead for the deployment of Jedi forces, to question why the Order that had served the Republic for 1,000 generations now seemed paralyzed by indecision. But the Jedi maintained their stance, trusting in the Force to reveal the proper path in its own time. Meanwhile, in the outer systems, another figure moved through the shadows, one whose influence would prove crucial to the unfolding tragedy. The being known only as the Sith Emperor had begun to take notice of the chaos consuming the galaxy. From his hidden empire beyond the known regions, he set in motion plans that would manipulate both sides of the conflict for his own dark purposes. Kreia watched all of this unfold with growing unease. Her students grew restless, their hearts torn between duty to the Order and compassion for the suffering masses. In the Academy's meditation chambers, she found herself questioning not just the Council's decision, but the very nature of the Force that supposedly guided it. If the Force truly sought balance and harmony, why did it permit such widespread destruction? If it was truly wise and benevolent, why did following its guidance lead to such moral paralysis? These questions would torment her in the quiet hours between lessons as she walked the moonlit paths of Dantooine and felt the weight of her students' expectations pressing down upon her shoulders. She had taught them to question, to think independently, to seek truth even when it was uncomfortable. Now that very teaching was leading them toward a decision that would challenge everything the Jedi Order stood for. The stage was set for a tragedy that would reshape the galaxy. In the tension between action and inaction, between compassion and wisdom, between the demands of the heart and the dictates of ancient tradition, the fate of countless beings hung in the balance. And at the center of it all stood Kreia, master teacher and unwitting architect of galactic catastrophe, about to learn the first of many bitter lessons about the true nature of the Force she had devoted her life to serving. The corridors of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant had witnessed the rise of countless Force wielders, but few possessed the raw intellectual hunger that drove young Kreia through her earliest years of training. Her mind operated like a precision instrument, dissecting every lesson, every principle, every sacred teaching of the Order with surgical clarity. Where other Padawans accepted the wisdom of their masters with grateful reverence, she subjected each piece of knowledge to rigorous examination, searching for flaws in logic, gaps in understanding, and unquestioned assumptions that might conceal deeper truths. Her master, RNK, was herself considered somewhat unconventional by the standards of the Jedi Council. A woman of Ikani heritage, whose combat skills were matched only by her philosophical curiosity, Kay recognized in her student a reflection of her own rebellious nature, amplified to an almost dangerous degree. During their private training sessions in the temple's ancient meditation chambers, she found herself both thrilled and troubled by the depth of Kreia's insights. The code speaks of there being no emotion, yet emotion is what drives beings to seek justice. Kreia observed during one such session, her young face serious beyond her years. It tells us there is no ignorance, yet we are constantly discovering new aspects of the Force that our predecessors never understood. Are we to believe that truth is static, that wisdom cannot evolve? These questions revealed a mind that refused to accept comfortable simplicities. Even as a Padawan, Kreia demonstrated an uncanny ability to perceive the psychological foundations underlying any belief system or social structure. She could look at a group of beings and instantly understand the hidden dynamics of power, fear, desire, and insecurity that truly governed their interactions, regardless of whatever noble principles they claimed to follow. This talent first manifested dramatically during a mission to the mining world of Perigus. The facility there had been plagued by a series of accidents that threatened to shut down production of fuel vital to the Republic's defense efforts. The official investigation had concluded that the incidents were simply the result of aging equipment and worker negligence, but Kreia sensed deeper currents at work. While her master met with facility administrators and safety inspectors, Kreia spent her time among the miners themselves. She listened to their complaints, their fears, their whispered conversations during shift changes. Within days, she had uncovered a complex web of sabotage orchestrated by a small group of workers who had been secretly influenced by Mandalorian agents seeking to disrupt Republic supply lines. The revelation of this plot might have been victory enough for most Padawans, but Kreia was disturbed by how easily she had manipulated the miners into revealing their secrets. She had not used forced persuasion or coercion, simply an intuitive understanding of what each person needed to hear to feel comfortable sharing information. She had become, in essence, a perfect mirror, reflecting back each individual's deepest needs and desires. This ability to see through surface appearances to the fundamental motivations driving all behavior became her greatest strength as she progressed through her training. Her lightsaber skills were adequate, her force techniques competent, but her understanding of the psychological landscape of any situation was virtually unmatched among her peers. Her elevation to the rank of Jedi Knight came earlier than was typical, partly due to her exceptional abilities, and partly because several council members felt she needed the responsibility and independence that came with the new rank to channel her rebellious tendencies constructively. She was assigned to the Dantooine enclave, ostensibly to learn patience and humility through service to the agricultural communities there. The crystal caves beneath the Dantooine enclave became her sanctuary and laboratory. The living crystals that grew there resonated with force energy in ways that made meditation both easier and more intense. It was during one of these deep meditative states that Kreia experienced what she would later describe as her first true glimpse behind the veil of reality. The Force, as she perceived it in that moment, was not the benevolent guide described in Jedi teachings, but something far more complex and potentially sinister. She felt its influence flowing through every living being, shaping thoughts, emotions, and decisions in ways so subtle that most never realized they were being manipulated. The concept of free will, which she had always taken for granted, suddenly seemed like a comfortable illusion. This revelation might have led to despair or madness in a less disciplined mind. But Kreia responded with characteristic determination to understand rather than simply accept. If the Force was indeed manipulating all living beings, then perhaps those beings could learn to recognize and resist that manipulation. The key, she reasoned, lay in education and the development of true self-awareness. Her opportunity to test these theories came with her first Padawan, a young Zabrak named Sion, whose raw potential was matched by his emotional volatility. Traditional Jedi training methods had failed repeatedly with this student, as his passionate nature seemed incompatible with the serenity that the Order demanded. Previous masters had recommended that he be dismissed from training entirely. Kreia saw in Sion's struggles not a fundamental flaw, but an opportunity to explore new approaches to instruction. Rather than trying to suppress his emotional nature, she taught him to understand and channel it. Instead of demanding blind obedience to the code, she encouraged him to question why each principle existed and how it might apply to specific situations. The transformation was remarkable. Sion's previous masters had seen only chaos and danger in his emotional intensity, but under Kreia's guidance, that same passion became a source of incredible focus and determination. He learned to use his feelings as tools rather than being controlled by them, and his understanding of the Force deepened in ways that surprised even his unconventional teacher. Word of her success with this problem student brought other challenging cases to her attention. Young Jedi who had been written off as too aggressive, too questioning, too independent, were sent to Dantooine in hopes that Kreia could either reform them or provide definitive proof that they were unsuitable for the Order. Each student presented new opportunities to refine her understanding of how minds could be shaped and guided without breaking their essential spirit. She developed techniques for pushing students toward specific realizations while allowing them to believe they had reached those conclusions independently. She learned to create scenarios that would force confrontation with uncomfortable truths about themselves and the galaxy around them. Her methods were undeniably effective, but they also alarmed some members of the Council who visited Dantooine to observe her work. Master Atris, in particular, expressed concern that Kreia was teaching students to manipulate others just as she manipulated them. The distinction between education and indoctrination, Atris argued, was becoming dangerously blurred. These criticisms stung partly because Kreia recognized their validity. She was indeed manipulating her students, albeit with what she believed were their best interests at heart. But this realization led her to an even more troubling question about the nature of teaching itself. Was all education simply a form of manipulation, whether acknowledged or not? And if so, was honest manipulation more ethical than the kind that pretended to respect student autonomy while actually constraining it within acceptable boundaries? The arrival of Revan and Alec as her students marked the beginning of her most ambitious experiment in alternative Jedi education. These two young men possessed not only exceptional Force sensitivity, but also brilliant strategic minds and natural leadership abilities. In them she saw the possibility of creating Jedi who could transcend the limitations of traditional training entirely, who could think and act with complete independence while still serving the cause of justice and peace. The holographic displays in the Dantooine Enclave's communications center painted a picture of systematic devastation that grew more comprehensive with each passing day. Entire star systems flickered and went dark as Mandalorian fleets advanced through the Outer Rim territories with methodical precision. What had begun as isolated raids on remote worlds had evolved into something far more threatening, a coordinated campaign of conquest that seemed designed not merely to expand Mandalorian territory, but to test the very foundations of Republic civilization. Kreia stood before these displays during the quiet hours before dawn, studying the tactical patterns with the same intensity she once reserved for ancient philosophical texts. The Mandalorians were not simply conquering worlds, they were systematically dismantling the cultural and economic networks that bound the Republic together. Trade routes were severed, communication relays destroyed, and entire populations either enslaved or scattered as refugees. The strategic implications were clear to anyone with sufficient military knowledge. But what disturbed Kreia more deeply were the psychological aspects of the Mandalorian approach. Their leader, known only as Mandalore the Ultimate, had crafted a campaign designed to exploit fundamental weaknesses in both the Republic's military doctrine and the Jedi Order's philosophical foundations. Every move seemed calculated to force difficult moral choices upon their enemies. Her students had begun gathering intelligence independently, using their growing network of contacts throughout the galaxy to supplement the official reports reaching the Enclave. Revan's analytical mind had identified patterns in Mandalorian tactics that suggested access to highly classified Republic strategic documents. Someone with intimate knowledge of Republic defensive capabilities was feeding information to the enemy, but the Jedi Council seemed either unwilling or unable to acknowledge this possibility. Alec's temperament made him less suited to intelligence analysis, but more capable of understanding the psychological impact of the war on individual systems and populations. His reports described entire worlds paralyzed by terror, their governments unable to decide whether to resist and face annihilation or surrender and accept Mandalorian rule. The Republic's promise of protection rang hollow when that protection was contingent upon decisions made by Jedi Masters meditating in distant temples. These developments forced Kreia to confront uncomfortable truths about the organization she had served faithfully for decades. The Jedi Council's decision to remain neutral while conducting lengthy consultations with the Force appeared wise and measured when viewed from the serene meditation chambers of Coruscant. From the perspective of worlds facing imminent invasion, however, it seemed like cowardice disguised as spiritual discipline. Her private communications with other Jedi Masters revealed a growing schism within the Order itself. Younger knights and recently elevated masters increasingly questioned the wisdom of inaction in the face of such clear aggression. Older, more traditional members of the Council maintained that hasty intervention without proper understanding of the Force's will could lead to catastrophic consequences for the galaxy as a whole. Master Kavar, whose wisdom Kreia had long respected, sent encrypted messages describing heated debates within the council chambers. The traditional faction, led by Masters Vrook and Atris, argued that the Mandalorian threat was itself part of some larger pattern that would only become clear through patient observation and meditation. Premature action, they insisted, could disrupt the Force's natural movement toward balance and resolution. The opposing viewpoint, championed by younger council members like Master Kavar himself, held that the Force worked through the actions of living beings rather than in spite of them. If the Jedi possessed the power to stop unnecessary suffering, they had a moral obligation to act regardless of whatever cosmic balance might be at stake. The debate had grown so intense that several masters had ceased speaking to one another entirely. This philosophical crisis within the Order's leadership created opportunities for Kreia to explore her own evolving understanding of the Force and its relationship to moral action. Her students had begun to see her not merely as a teacher, but as a voice of clarity in a galaxy consumed by confusion and indecision. They came to her private chambers, seeking guidance not just on lightsaber techniques or Force manipulation, but on fundamental questions about duty, loyalty, and the nature of righteous action. During one such gathering, as reports arrived of the fall of Sirocco and the massacre of its 4 billion inhabitants, Dantooine posed the question that had been haunting them all. Master, if the Force truly seeks balance and harmony, why does it permit such wholesale slaughter? Are we to believe that the deaths of innocents serve some higher purpose that we are too limited to understand? The question struck at the heart of Kreia's own doubts about Jedi doctrine. She had spent years teaching her students to think independently, to question comfortable assumptions, to seek truth even when it challenged established authority. Now those same lessons were leading them toward conclusions that put them in direct opposition to the Jedi Council's will. Her response that evening would later be remembered by her students as the moment when their beloved teacher began her transformation into something else entirely. "Perhaps," she said, her voice carrying a weight of contemplation that bordered on heresy, "the Force is not the benevolent guide we have been taught to revere. Perhaps it is something more complex, more morally ambiguous than our simple categorizations of light and dark can encompass." This suggestion opened floodgates of theological speculation that had been dammed up behind years of orthodox training. If the Force was not inherently good, then serving its will might not automatically align with moral righteousness. If the Jedi had been wrong about the fundamental nature of their guiding principle, then perhaps they had been wrong about other things as well. Revan, whose strategic mind thrived on complex problems, began developing scenarios in which Jedi intervention could end the Mandalorian threat swiftly and decisively. His plans were brilliant, ruthless, and completely at odds with the Council's preference for defensive action. When he presented these strategies to Kreia, she found herself unable to identify significant flaws in his reasoning. The military situation continued to deteriorate, while the Jedi meditated. Mandalorian forces had begun probing attacks against mid-rim systems, testing Republic defensive capabilities, and measuring response times. Their tactics showed intimate knowledge of Jedi combat doctrine, suggesting that they had developed specific countermeasures for Force wielders. Intelligence reports from the few survivors of conquered worlds painted a disturbing picture of Mandalorian occupation policies. They were not simply taking territory and resources, but actively working to destroy the philosophical and cultural foundations of Republic civilization. Libraries burned, universities closed, and entire intellectual traditions vanished under the systematically applied brutality of warrior rule. Kreia recognized in these reports evidence of something that chilled her more than mere military conquest. The Mandalorians seemed to understand that their true enemy was not the Republic's military forces, but the ideas and values that held Republic society together. They were waging war not just against armies and fleets, but against the concept of civilization itself. This realization crystallized her growing conviction that the Jedi Council's passive response was not merely strategically inadequate, but morally catastrophic. By refusing to act, the Order was essentially collaborating in the destruction of everything they claimed to protect. Their meditation and soul-searching were luxuries purchased with the blood of beings they had sworn to defend. The final catalyst came with news of the Mandalorian assault on Althir. The agricultural world had sent desperate pleas for aid as enemy fleets approached, begging the Jedi to remember their ancient promises of protection. The Council's response had been to assign a single Jedi consular to evacuate selected cultural artifacts and historical documents before the inevitable fall. When the reports arrived describing Althir's final hours, Kreia felt something fundamental shift within her understanding of the Force, the Jedi, and her own moral obligations. The systematic extermination of an entire planetary population, while Jedi Masters debated theological fine points, represented a failure so complete that it called into question the very foundations of everything she had believed about the nature of good and evil in the galaxy. The breaking point arrived not with dramatic revelation, but through gradual erosion of faith, like water wearing away stone until a mighty foundation crumbles without warning. Kreia had watched her most promising students depart for war against her council and the explicit orders of the Jedi Council, their faces bearing expressions of grim determination that reminded her painfully of her own younger self. Revan and Alec had chosen action over contemplation, compassion over obedience, and in doing so had revealed the fundamental bankruptcy of the philosophical system she had spent her life serving. Their departure left her alone in the crystal caves beneath Dantooine, surrounded by the living stones that hummed with force energy, yet offered no wisdom adequate to the crisis consuming the galaxy. The traditional meditative techniques that had once brought her clarity now seemed like exercises in willful blindness. How could she seek guidance from a force that permitted such systematic slaughter, while those capable of stopping it waited for clearer signs of divine will? The reports that filtered back from the war zone painted a picture of her former students achieving exactly what she had taught them to achieve. They thought independently, acted decisively, and took responsibility for the consequences of their choices. Under Revan's brilliant strategic leadership, the Republic's forces had begun pushing back Mandalorian advances for the first time since the conflict began. Worlds that had seemed doomed to conquest were liberated, populations that faced annihilation were saved, and the tide of war slowly turned in favor of civilization over barbarism. These victories should have vindicated her teaching methods and validated her students' decision to act against council orders. Instead, they filled her with a growing sense of unease that she struggled to understand. If Revan and Alec were succeeding through the very independence of thought she had cultivated in them, why did their success feel like a failure of her fundamental understanding of how the galaxy actually worked? The answer came through her deepening study of Sith philosophy, an investigation she had begun as academic curiosity, but which gradually became something approaching obsession. The ancient texts hidden in the deepest archives of the Jedi Temple revealed truths about the nature of power and manipulation that orthodox training had never acknowledged. The Sith understood something that the Jedi refused to admit about the relationship between teacher and student, master and apprentice, leader and follower. All education was manipulation. All teaching was a form of control exercised by one mind over another. The Jedi simply disguised this reality behind noble rhetoric about guidance and wisdom, while the Sith acknowledged it openly and used it more effectively. Her students had not learned to think independently despite her teaching, but because of the specific ways she had shaped their thoughts and directed their development. This realization led her to an even more disturbing conclusion about the Force itself. If all conscious beings were constantly manipulating one another through various forms of influence and persuasion, and if the Force connected all living things, then perhaps the Force was simply the ultimate expression of this universal tendency toward manipulation and control. The light side and dark side might be nothing more than different approaches to the same fundamental reality, the exercise of power over others. Her exile from Dantooine began not with formal banishment, but through gradual isolation as other Jedi grew uncomfortable with her increasingly heretical questions and observations. Master Kavar visited less frequently, their conversations grew shorter and more strained, and she found herself spending longer periods alone in meditation that resembled brooding more than traditional Jedi contemplation. The discovery of the Traya Academy on Malachor V came through ancient star charts referenced in Sith texts she had been studying. The Forgotten World existed at the junction of several major hyperspace routes that had been abandoned after a series of navigation disasters made the region too dangerous for regular travel. According to the historical records, it had once served as a testing ground for Force wielders who sought knowledge that transcended the artificial boundaries between light and dark. Her first journey to Malachor V revealed a world saturated with dark side energy to such a degree that simply breathing the atmosphere was an exercise in resistance to corruption. The ancient academy built into the planet's crust had been abandoned for millennia, but its chambers and laboratories remained intact, preserved by the same dark energies that made the world itself virtually uninhabitable for most beings. Within those shadowed halls, Kreia found texts and artifacts that painted a radically different picture of Force philosophy than anything she had encountered in Jedi archives. The ancient inhabitants of Triceus Academy had rejected both Jedi and Sith orthodoxy in favor of a more comprehensive understanding of the Force as a tool rather than a master. They had sought to transcend the eternal conflict between light and dark by refusing to be bound by either extreme. This knowledge seemed to offer solutions to the philosophical problems that had tormented her since her student's departure. If the Force was indeed a tool rather than a guide, then perhaps it could be used to break the cycle of manipulation and control that seemed to govern all relationships between conscious beings. Perhaps it was possible to teach students to achieve true independence by showing them how to resist not just obvious forms of coercion but the subtle influences of the Force itself. Her transformation into Darth Traya began not as a fall to the dark side, but as what she understood to be a necessary evolution beyond the limitations of both light and dark. She took the title not out of desire for power or status, but as a declaration of independence from the philosophical constraints that had kept her from achieving her true potential as a teacher and guide. The reconstruction of Triceus Academy became her first project as a Sith Lord, though her vision for the institution differed radically from traditional Sith training methods. Where classical Sith education focused on domination and the accumulation of personal power, her academy would teach students to recognize and resist all forms of manipulation, including those exercised by the Force itself. Her first apprentices came to her not through conquest or coercion, but because they sought the kind of knowledge that no other teacher could provide. Darth Traya, her former Padawan, had been transformed by his experiences in the Mandalorian Wars into something that transcended normal human limitations. His body had been shattered beyond repair, yet his will to survive had become so absolute that he could maintain life through sheer force of determination. Darth Nihilus presented a different kind of challenge and opportunity. The young man had been present at Malachor V during the final battle of the Mandalorian Wars, when Revan had activated a superweapon that ended the conflict by destroying both Mandalorian and Republic fleets simultaneously. The traumatic experience had left him with an insatiable hunger for Force energy that threatened to consume not just enemies but entire worlds. In these two beings, Kreia saw the possibility of creating apprentices who could help her achieve goals that transcended traditional Sith ambitions. Science's mastery over death itself and Nihilus's ability to drain the Force from living beings represented new approaches to understanding and manipulating the fundamental energies of existence. Together they formed what would become known as the Sith Triumvirate, though Kreia understood from the beginning that this alliance was temporary and that her ultimate goals would require her to transcend even these relationships. She had learned from her experiences with Revan and Alec that all students eventually surpass their teachers, and she intended to use this inevitable betrayal as part of a larger plan that neither of her new apprentices could possibly comprehend. The Academy on Malachor V became a laboratory for exploring the possibilities of Force manipulation, unconstrained by traditional moral or philosophical limitations. Students came seeking power and knowledge, but Kreia's true curriculum involved teaching them to question the very foundations of their desires and ambitions. The Sith Triumvirate represented something unprecedented in the history of Force users. A deliberate attempt to transcend the traditional master and apprentice relationship that had defined both Jedi and Sith training for millennia. Kreia understood that the classical Sith approach of constant betrayal and competition between teacher and student was ultimately self-defeating, producing powerful individuals but never achieving lasting transformation of the galactic order itself. Her vision required something more sophisticated, a collaboration between equals who could challenge and refine each other's understanding while working toward shared objectives. Darth Traya's presence on Malachor V created an atmosphere of perpetual tension that served Kreia's pedagogical purposes perfectly. His mastery over his own death had been achieved through such complete rejection of physical limitations that his very existence challenged conventional understanding of what was possible through Force manipulation. Students who came to the academy expecting traditional Sith training found themselves confronted by a being whose power derived not from anger or hatred, but from absolute will, exercised in defiance of natural law. Under Kreia's guidance, Sion developed teaching methods that complemented her own psychological approach with lessons in the transcendence of physical constraint. Students learned to push their bodies beyond normal endurance, to function despite injury or exhaustion, to treat pain as information rather than limitation. These techniques produced Force users who could operate effectively in situations that would incapacitate traditionally trained Jedi or Sith. Darth Nihilus presented different opportunities and challenges for the Academy's experimental curriculum. His hunger for Force energy was so profound that it threatened to consume not just individual opponents, but entire planetary populations. This ability made him extraordinarily dangerous, but it also offered unique insights into the fundamental nature of the Force itself. Through careful observation of how his power operated, Kreia began to understand the Force as something that could be drained, weakened, or even potentially destroyed. The implications of this revelation were staggering. If the Force could be diminished or eliminated entirely, then it might be possible to free all living beings from its subtle but pervasive influence over their thoughts, emotions, and decisions. The eternal conflict between light and dark that had defined galactic history for thousands of years might finally be resolved not through victory of one side over the other, but through elimination of the underlying cause of the conflict itself. Kreia's experiments in Force manipulation during this period pushed the boundaries of what had previously been considered possible. Working with Nihilus, she developed techniques for detecting and measuring Force sensitivity in individuals, for artificially enhancing or suppressing Force abilities, and for creating what she termed echoes in the Force, disruptions that could propagate across vast distances and affect entire populations. The Academy's students became unwitting test subjects for these experiments, though Kreia convinced herself that the knowledge gained justified the risks involved. Some students emerged from training with abilities that far exceeded their natural potential, while others suffered permanent damage to their connection with the Force. A few disappeared entirely, their fate known only to Kreia and her two apprentices. The most promising students were inducted into deeper levels of training that revealed the true scope of Kreia's ambitions. They learned that the traditional Sith goal of galactic domination was merely a stepping stone towards something far more radical, the complete transformation of the relationship between conscious beings and the Force. This knowledge created an inner circle of disciples who were fanatically devoted to their master's vision, though none fully understood the ultimate implications of what they were working to achieve. Communications with the broader galactic community during this period revealed the extent to which Revan's victories in the Mandalorian Wars had destabilized the existing order. The young Jedi general had returned from the conflict as a conquering hero, but reports from Republic intelligence suggested that he and Malak had been changed by their experiences in ways that troubled the Jedi Council. Their methods had become increasingly ruthless, their strategic thinking influenced by Mandalorian tactical doctrine, and their respect for traditional Jedi limitations had eroded under the pressures of command. Kreia monitored these developments with intense interest, recognizing in them validation of her theories about the corrupting influence of power and the inadequacy of traditional Jedi training to prepare individuals for the moral complexities of real-world leadership. Her former students were discovering the same uncomfortable truths about the nature of authority and control that had led her own transformation into Darth Traya. The establishment of communication networks between Malachor V and other sites of Sith activity throughout the galaxy allowed Kreia to extend her influence far beyond the confines of the Academy. She began recruiting agents and allies from among disaffected Jedi, ambitious Republic officials, and survivors of the Mandalorian Wars who had lost faith in the institutions that had failed to protect them. These recruitment efforts revealed the extent to which the galactic community had been traumatized by recent events. Entire populations had been displaced, traditional authorities had lost credibility, and millions of beings were searching for new sources of meaning and purpose in lives that had been shattered by war. Kreia recognized this widespread disillusionment as an opportunity to plant the seeds of a philosophical revolution that could eventually encompass the entire galaxy. Her agents worked subtly to undermine confidence in both Jedi and Republic institutions, not through obvious sabotage or terrorism, but through careful cultivation of doubt and cynicism. They spread rumors about Jedi hypocrisy, Republic corruption, and the futility of trusting in authorities who had proven incapable of protecting their citizens when protection was most needed. These efforts required patience and subtlety, but they gradually created a climate of opinion that would prove receptive to more radical alternatives. The development of new Force techniques during this period focused particularly on methods for detecting and exploiting psychological vulnerabilities in potential targets. Students learned to identify the hidden fears, desires, and resentments that motivated their opponents, and to use this knowledge to achieve their objectives without resorting to obvious coercion or violence. These skills proved invaluable for infiltrating and manipulating existing power structures throughout the galaxy. Kreia's own abilities continued to evolve as she explored the deeper mysteries of Malachor V and incorporated knowledge from ancient Sith texts into her personal practice. She developed techniques for projecting her consciousness across vast distances, for manipulating the perceptions and memories of other beings, and for creating complex illusions that could deceive even other Force users. These powers made her an increasingly formidable opponent, but they also isolated her further from normal human experience and emotion. The philosophical framework that emerged from the Academy's research challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of good and evil, freedom and determinism, individual autonomy and cosmic order. Students learned to see the traditional conflict between light and dark as a false dichotomy that served only to perpetuate the Force's control over conscious beings. True liberation, according to this new doctrine, required rejection of both extremes in favor of a path that transcended such limitations entirely. The Academy's influence began to spread beyond Malachor V as graduates returned to their home worlds, carrying these revolutionary ideas with them. Secret societies formed among Force-sensitive individuals who had become disillusioned with traditional training methods. Underground networks developed to share forbidden knowledge and coordinate resistance to orthodox authorities. The seeds of what would eventually become a galaxy-wide challenge to established order had been planted and were beginning to germinate. Despite these successes, Kreia remained troubled by growing tensions between her two apprentices. Saurian's contempt for physical weakness put him at odds with Nihilus's hunger for the life energy of others, while Nihilus's indiscriminate consumption threatened to destroy the very populations that Saurian sought to rule through strength and intimidation. Their philosophical differences reflected deeper contradictions in Sith doctrine that Kreia had hoped to resolve through her alternative approach to training and education. The betrayal came not as a sudden shock, but as the inevitable culmination of forces that Kreia had set in motion through her own teaching methods. She had spent years instructing Sion and Nihilus to think independently, to question authority, to trust their own judgment over the dictates of tradition or hierarchy. In pursuing these lessons to their logical conclusion, her apprentices had begun to see their master herself as an obstacle to their continued development and the achievement of their individual ambitions. The signs had been accumulating for months before the final confrontation. Saurian's communications with external agents had become more frequent and secretive, while his deference to Kreia's judgment had gradually transformed into barely concealed impatience with her philosophical complexities. His approach to power was fundamentally more direct than hers, focused on domination through superior strength, rather than the subtle manipulation of beliefs and motivations that she preferred. Nihilus presented a different but equally troubling evolution. His hunger for Force energy had grown so intense that he could barely restrain himself from consuming the life essence of other Academy students during training sessions. Worse, Kreia had begun to suspect that his appetite might eventually extend to her own considerable force presence. The techniques she had developed for studying and channeling his abilities had revealed the truly indiscriminate nature of his power, which recognized no distinction between ally and enemy when the hunger became overwhelming. Their alliance had been forged through shared rejection of traditional Sith hierarchies, but Kreia had underestimated how thoroughly her apprentices would internalize the lessons of independence and self-determination that she had taught them. They had learned to see beyond the comfortable illusions of loyalty and mutual benefit that governed most master and apprentice relationships, recognizing these bonds as simply more sophisticated forms of the manipulation and control that characterized all interactions between conscious beings. The philosophical discussions that had once energized the Academy's intellectual atmosphere gradually became exercises in barely concealed hostility as the three Sith Lords tested each other's positions and probed for weaknesses in their respective worldviews. Sion argued that Kreia's vision of transcending the Force was ultimately impossible because consciousness itself was inseparable from the energy field that connected all living things. Nihilus, when he could be persuaded to articulate his thoughts coherently, suggested that the only meaningful transcendence lay in consuming the Force entirely, absorbing its power until nothing remained but pure will unconstrained by any external influence. These debates revealed fundamental incompatibilities in their approaches that no amount of discussion or compromise could resolve. Kreia's goal of liberating beings from force manipulation required preserving their essential nature while freeing them from external control. Sojourn's path toward transcendence through absolute will demanded the subordination of others to his superior strength and determination. Nihilus's hunger pointed toward a universe drained of all life energy except that which he himself possessed and controlled. The Academy's other students began to choose sides in this emerging conflict, though most were unaware of the true stakes involved. Some gravitated towards Sion's philosophy of power through pain and endurance, drawn by the promise of abilities that could overcome any physical limitation. Others found themselves fascinated by Nihilus's demonstration of power over life and death itself, despite the obvious dangers of exposure to his influence. The Kreia recognized in these divisions the same patterns that had destroyed previous Sith organizations throughout galactic history. The cycle of master training apprentice only to be eventually overthrown and replaced seemed inescapable, built into the very structure of relationships based on the accumulation and exercise of power over others. Her attempt to transcend this pattern through collaborative hierarchy had simply created more sophisticated versions of the same fundamental conflicts. The actual confrontation began not with lightsaber combat or dramatic force powers, but with a systematic campaign to isolate Kreia from her sources of support and information. Suin and Nihilus had coordinated their efforts carefully, identifying key Academy personnel who could be turned against their master through a combination of promises, threats, and carefully crafted appeals to their personal ambitions and resentments. Students who had once competed for Kreia's attention and approval found themselves approached by one or both of her apprentices with offers of more direct paths to power and knowledge. The subtle psychological manipulations that Kreia had used to guide their development were turned against her as Sion and Nihilus exploited weaknesses and blind spots that they had observed during years of close association with their intended victim. The most devastating aspect of the betrayal was how thoroughly it validated Kreia's own theories about the nature of teaching and manipulation. Her apprentices had learned their lessons too well, applying her own methods against her with a precision and effectiveness that she could not help but admire, even as it destroyed everything she had worked to build. They had proven that all relationships based on authority and instruction were ultimately unstable, containing within themselves the seeds of their own destruction. The final confrontation took place in the deepest chambers of the Academy, surrounded by ancient Sith artifacts and the accumulated dark side energy of millennia. Kreia faced her former apprentices, not with surprise or outrage, but with a kind of bitter satisfaction at seeing her philosophical theories confirmed so dramatically. The force that she had sought to transcend had simply used her own students as instruments to demonstrate the futility of her ambitions. Sion's physical attacks were relentless and methodical, each blow designed not just to cause damage but to demonstrate the superiority of his approach to transcending mortal limitations. His body had been destroyed and rebuilt so many times that pain had become meaningless to him, while his will had been refined into an instrument of such purity that it could sustain life through sheer determination alone. Nihilus's assault operated on a more fundamental level, attempting to drain the force energy that sustained Kreia's extraordinary abilities. His hunger reached out to encompass not just her personal power, but the accumulated knowledge and experience that made her such a formidable opponent. The sensation of having her life force consumed was unlike anything she had ever experienced, a violation that penetrated to the very core of her identity and sense of self. Despite her considerable abilities and decades of experience, Kreia found herself overwhelmed by the coordinated assault of her former apprentices. They had studied her techniques too thoroughly, understood her psychological patterns too completely, and prepared for this confrontation too carefully for her to mount an effective defense. The outcome was never truly in doubt once they had committed themselves to the course of betrayal. Her defeat was absolute and humiliating, involving not just the loss of her position and authority, but the stripping away of much of her connection to the Force itself. Nihilus's hunger had permanently damaged her ability to access the full range of powers that had once made her one of the most feared beings in the galaxy. The injury was not just physical but spiritual, severing bonds with the cosmic energy field that had defined her identity for decades. The exile that followed was both punishment and education, forcing Kreia to experience firsthand the isolation and powerlessness that characterized the lives of ordinary beings throughout the galaxy. Stripped of her abilities and authority, cast out from the institution she had created, she was compelled to see the universe from the perspective of those who lacked the Force sensitivity that had always set her apart from common humanity. This experience of vulnerability and dependence would prove to be the most valuable education of her entire life, teaching her lessons about the nature of strength and weakness that no amount of theoretical study could have provided. In losing everything that had defined her identity as a Sith Lord, she began to understand the true scope of what she would need to achieve to fulfill her ultimate ambitions. The years following her exile from Malachor V transformed Kreia's understanding of existence in ways that no amount of academic study or philosophical speculation could have achieved. Stripped of the Force abilities that had defined her identity since childhood, she was compelled to navigate the galaxy as an ordinary being, dependent on intelligence, cunning, and force of personality rather than supernatural powers. This experience revealed aspects of reality that had been invisible to her during decades of Force sensitivity. Her first months as an exile were spent in the lower levels of Nar Shaddaa, the smuggler's moon, where beings could disappear into the urban maze without questions being asked about their past or their reasons for seeking anonymity. The transition from Sith Lord to anonymous refugee was jarring beyond anything she had anticipated. Skills that had once seemed fundamental to her nature, the ability to sense the emotions and intentions of others, to influence minds through subtle Force manipulation, to perceive danger before it manifested physically, were simply gone. In their absence, she discovered capabilities that had been dormant throughout her Force-using years. Her natural intelligence, unaugmented by precognitive insights, proved sharper and more focused than she had realized. Her understanding of psychology and motivation, stripped of Force-enhanced empathy, became more precise and analytical. Most importantly, her ability to observe and learn from pure sensory input, without the overlay of Force impressions, allowed her to perceive patterns and connections that had been obscured by her previous reliance on supernatural awareness. The criminal underworld of Nan Shaddaa operated according to principles that both mirrored and inverted the power structures she had known among Force users. Here, influence flowed through networks of debt, obligation, fear, and mutual benefit rather than through mastery of cosmic energies. Survival depended on understanding complex social hierarchies, recognizing unspoken agreements and betrayals, and navigating between competing factions without triggering conflicts that could prove fatal. These lessons in mundane survival proved invaluable for understanding how the vast majority of galactic civilization actually functioned. Force users, whether Jedi or Sith, existed as a tiny minority whose supernatural abilities isolated them from the everyday experiences that shaped the lives of ordinary beings. Their perspective on galactic affairs was inevitably distorted by powers that allowed them to transcend normal limitations and consequences. Living without the Force revealed the extent to which her previous worldview had been shaped by assumptions that only applied to the Force-sensitive elite. The philosophical questions that had driven her transformation into Darth Traya, questions about free will versus cosmic manipulation, individual autonomy versus universal connection, suddenly seemed less relevant when viewed from the perspective of beings who had never experienced direct communion with galactic consciousness. Her observations of non-Force-sensitive beings revealed remarkable resilience and creativity in the face of challenges that would have seemed insurmountable to someone accustomed to supernatural solutions. Without the ability to sense danger through the Force, people developed sophisticated systems of communication and mutual protection. Without Force-enhanced perception, they created technologies and social structures that amplified their natural capabilities. Without the guidance of cosmic energy, they relied on reason, experience, and collaborative decision-making to navigate complex moral and practical dilemmas. These revelations forced her to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the relationship between Force sensitivity and wisdom, power and virtue, supernatural ability and moral development. The Force users she had known, herself included, had often demonstrated remarkable blindness to consequences that were obvious to ordinary beings with no special powers. Their ability to transcend immediate limitations had made them careless about the long-term implications of their actions. Her work during this period took many forms as she moved through different sectors of galactic society, always careful to avoid detection by those who might recognize her despite her changed circumstances. She served as a negotiator in labor disputes, using her understanding of motivation and persuasion to find solutions that satisfied competing interests. She worked as an information broker, trading knowledge and insights for the resources needed to survive. She even spent time as a teacher in refugee settlements, helping displaced populations develop skills and strategies for rebuilding their lives. Each of these roles provided new perspectives on the impact that Force users had on galactic civilization. The Jedi were remembered fondly by some populations, but viewed with suspicion by others who had been collateral damage in conflicts between light and dark. The Sith were universally feared, but that fear was often mixed with resentment at having been treated as pawns in games they could not understand or influence. Most revealing were her encounters with beings who had survived traumatic experiences involving Force users. Veterans of the Mandalorian Wars described the psychological impact of watching Jedi generals make decisions that sacrificed thousands of lives for strategic advantages. Survivors of Sith occupation told stories of arbitrary cruelty inflicted by beings whose power made them accountable to no authority except their own desires. These testimonies revealed the human cost of conflicts that Force users typically understood only in abstract terms. A growing network of contacts throughout the galaxy provided intelligence about the ongoing consequences of the choices she had made as Darth Traya. Sachin had established himself as a warlord, using his mastery over death to intimidate enemies and inspire fanatical loyalty among followers. His methods were brutal but effective, creating pockets of order through the systematic application of violence against anyone who challenged his authority. Nihilus had become something else entirely, a walking catastrophe that consumed entire worlds in his insatiable hunger for Force energy. Reports from the few survivors of his attacks describe populations drained of life in moments, leaving behind dead worlds where nothing could survive. His existence had become a threat, not just to individual enemies, but to the continuation of life itself in large sections of the galaxy. The contrast between her former apprentices and her own current circumstances provided painful insight into the true nature of the path she had chosen. By seeking to transcend the limitations of both Jedi and Sith philosophy, she had instead created more extreme versions of the very problems she had hoped to solve. Sechen's absolute will and Nihilus's unlimited hunger represented logical extensions of her teachings about independence from external authority and constraint. This realization led to a profound shift in her understanding of what would be required to achieve her ultimate goal of freeing the galaxy from Force manipulation. The solution could not come through the accumulation of greater power or the development of more sophisticated techniques for controlling cosmic energies. Instead, it would require something that no Force user had ever attempted: the complete elimination of the Force itself as a factor in galactic affairs. The theoretical framework for such an unprecedented achievement began to emerge through her observations of how ordinary beings functioned without Force sensitivity. They had developed civilizations, created art and literature, solved complex problems, and formed meaningful relationships, all without any connection to the cosmic energy field that Force users considered essential to life itself. If they could thrive without the Force, perhaps all beings could learn to do the same. Her search for allies in this impossible undertaking led her eventually to rumors about a being who had survived something that should have been fatal to any Force user: the complete severing of connection to the Force itself. This individual, known only as the Exile, had somehow continued to exist and function despite being cut off from the energy that supposedly bound all living things together. The very existence of such a being offered hope that her ultimate vision might be achievable, that it was possible for Force-sensitive individuals to survive and even thrive without their supernatural abilities. If one person could transcend the limitations of Force dependency, perhaps that achievement could be replicated on a galactic scale, freeing all beings from the subtle manipulations and eternal conflicts that had shaped the course of civilization for millennia. The reunion with her former student came not through chance, but through carefully orchestrated manipulation that had taken years to arrange. Kreia had tracked the Exile's movements across the galaxy, studying the unique individual who had achieved what she believed impossible: survival after complete severance from the Force. This being represented living proof that her ultimate vision could be realized, that consciousness could exist independently of the cosmic energy field that bound all other life together. When she finally approached the Exile on Perigus II, disguising herself as a frail old woman seeking passage to safety, Kreia was testing more than just her ability to remain unrecognized. She was examining whether this remarkable individual had truly transcended Force dependency or simply found alternative ways of accessing cosmic energies. The initial interactions confirmed her most optimistic projections about what she had discovered. The Exile moved through the galaxy, creating what Kreia termed echoes, disruptions in the Force that rippled outward from their presence and influenced the development of other beings in subtle but measurable ways. Unlike traditional Force users who drew power from the cosmic energy field, this individual seemed to generate their own influence through pure force of will and personality. They were not manipulated by the Force because they existed outside its direct influence, yet they could still affect others who remained connected to it. Her decision to travel aboard the Ibn Hawk under her assumed identity allowed for extended observation of how the exile interacted with a diverse group of companions, each representing different aspects of galactic civilization and varying degrees of force sensitivity. The ship became a laboratory where she could study the dynamics of influence and leadership exercised by someone who operated according to principles that transcended traditional categories of light and dark side alignment. Aten Rand presented the most fascinating case study among the crew members. His background as a Sith assassin specialized in hunting Jedi had given him intimate knowledge of Force user psychology and methods. Yet, his interaction with the exile revealed possibilities for redemption and transformation that traditional Jedi counseling had never achieved. Under the exile's unconscious influence, Aten began developing Force sensitivity of his own, but in ways that seemed more authentic and self-directed than typical Padawan training. The Malachor V offered different insights into the nature of Force dependency and the possibility of transcending it. Her species had evolved to perceive the galaxy entirely through Force sight, making them utterly dependent on cosmic energies for basic survival. Yet exposure to the exile's unique nature began to change her relationship with the Force itself, teaching her to see beyond the artificial distinctions between light and dark that had governed her previous existence as Nihilus's apprentice. Most intriguing was Darth, the Zabrak engineer, whose guilt over his role in constructing the mass shadow generator had created a complex relationship with both technology and the Force. His interactions with the exile demonstrated how ordinary beings could achieve extraordinary things through skill, dedication, and moral clarity, rather than supernatural powers. His droid companion, built with components that somehow enhanced rather than suppressed Force sensitivity in others, suggested new possibilities for combining technology with cosmic energies. Through careful manipulation of conversations and circumstances, Kreia guided the exile and their companions through experiences designed to test and develop their understanding of power, responsibility, and the nature of moral choice. Each world they visited became an opportunity to explore different aspects of the philosophical questions that had driven her own transformation from Jedi Master to Sith Lord to something beyond both traditions. On Tellus, the Restoration Project offered lessons about the relationship between preservation and change, tradition and innovation. The conflict between different factions working to rebuild the devastated world paralleled larger galactic struggles between those who sought to restore the old order and those who recognized the need for fundamental transformation. The exile's choices in resolving these conflicts revealed an approach to leadership that transcended the binary thinking that had trapped both Jedi and Sith for millennia. The Merchant Queen Onderon provided opportunities to examine how political power operated in societies where Force users were viewed with suspicion rather than reverence. The civil war there had been influenced by Sith manipulation, but its resolution required understanding of mundane factors like economics, social class, and cultural identity that supernatural powers alone could not address. The exile's success in navigating these complexities demonstrated the superiority of integrated thinking over reliance on Force guidance alone. Dantooine's condition as a wounded world struggling to rebuild after Malak's devastation offered particularly poignant lessons about the consequences of choices made by Force users without adequate consideration of their impact on ordinary beings. The survivors there had developed remarkable resilience and ingenuity in the absence of Jedi protection, creating new forms of community organization and mutual support that were in some ways superior to what had existed before the destruction. Each of these experiences was carefully orchestrated by Kreia to push the exile toward deeper understanding of their unique nature and the possibilities it represented. She revealed information selectively, answered questions with more questions, and created situations that forced moral choices without obvious right answers. Her teaching methods had evolved far beyond what she had used with Revan and Alec, incorporating everything she had learned about manipulation, psychology, and the development of independent thinking. The other crew members served as unwitting subjects for her experiments in alternative approaches to Force training and development. She observed how each individual responded to the exile's influence, noting which aspects of their personalities were enhanced and which limitations were transcended. These observations provided valuable data about how her ultimate vision might be implemented on a galactic scale. Her relationship with each companion was carefully calibrated to their individual psychological needs and intellectual capabilities. With Aton, she played the role of the wise elder who could see through his defensive cynicism to the hurt and guilt beneath. With Vices, she became the philosophical challenger who questioned comfortable assumptions about destiny and purpose. With Baudure, she explored the intersection of technological innovation and moral responsibility. Throughout this extended journey, Kreia maintained her disguise as a harmless old woman, while subtly manipulating events to create the educational experiences that both the exile and their companions required for their continued development. Her methods were so sophisticated that most of the crew never realized how extensively their thoughts and choices were being influenced by her interventions. The ship itself became a symbol of the kind of community that might be possible in a galaxy freed from Force manipulation. Beings of different species, backgrounds, and philosophical orientations worked together effectively because they were united by genuine respect and affection rather than artificial bonds created through cosmic energy. Their conflicts were resolved through discussion and compromise rather than through the assertion of superior power or authority. This extended period of observation and manipulation confirmed Kreia's growing conviction that the Force was indeed the source of the galaxy's fundamental problems. Every conflict they encountered, every moral dilemma they faced, every tragedy they witnessed could ultimately be traced back to the influence of cosmic energies that turned beings into unwitting instruments of forces beyond their understanding or control. The exile's unique nature offered hope that these patterns could be broken, that it was possible for conscious beings to exist and thrive without being manipulated by cosmic forces beyond their comprehension. But achieving this transformation on a galactic scale would require more than just the example of one remarkable individual. It would require a catalyst so powerful and dramatic that it could sever the connection between the Force and all living beings permanently. As they approached their final destination, Kreia knew that the time for subtle manipulation and gradual education was ending. The ultimate test of everything she had learned and taught was about to begin, and its outcome would determine whether her vision of galactic liberation could ever become reality. The return to Malachor V marked the convergence of decades of planning, manipulation, and philosophical evolution into a single moment of truth that would determine the fate of every living being in the galaxy. As the Ebon Hawk descended through the planet's turbulent atmosphere, Kreia felt the familiar weight of dark side energy pressing against her consciousness, but now she experienced it differently than during her years as Darth Traya. What had once seemed like a source of power now revealed itself as another form of cosmic manipulation, the Force using the planet's traumatic history to influence the thoughts and emotions of all who entered its influence. The academy she had built within the planet's crust had been transformed during her absence into something that exceeded even her original vision. Sion had expanded the facility's physical structure, while Nihilus had saturated every chamber with the residual energy of his feeding, creating an environment so thoroughly infused with Force power that simply breathing the air was an exercise in resistance to corruption. The combination of their influences had turned her former seat of learning into a nexus of dark side energy that could be felt across multiple star systems. Her first encounter with Sion revealed how completely her former apprentice had embraced the philosophy of transcendence through absolute will. His body showed evidence of countless deaths and resurrections, each cycle of destruction and renewal stripping away more of his humanity while reinforcing his determination to continue existing through sheer force of refusal to accept defeat. He had become something that was no longer entirely alive in any conventional sense, yet possessed a kind of immortality that mocked traditional understanding of life and death. The confrontation with Sion served multiple purposes in Kreia's overall strategy. On the surface, it appeared to be a simple battle between former master and rebellious apprentice, a familiar pattern that had played out countless times throughout Sith history. In reality, it was a carefully orchestrated demonstration designed to show the exile the ultimate futility of power based on force manipulation, regardless of whether that power drew from light or dark side energies. Sion's defeat came not through superior combat skills or more powerful force techniques, but through psychological manipulation that exploited the fundamental contradiction in his approach to immortality. His refusal to die was ultimately motivated by fear, specifically fear of the meaninglessness that would result from acknowledging that his suffering had served no greater purpose. When Kreia convinced him that his death could serve her ultimate goal of freeing the galaxy from force manipulation, his will to continue existing finally crumbled. The encounter with Nihilus presented even greater challenges and opportunities. Her former apprentice had evolved far beyond anything she had anticipated during their time together at the academy. His hunger had grown so complete that he had become essentially a wound in the Force itself, a void that consumed cosmic energy while offering nothing in return. His very existence proved that the Force could indeed be damaged, weakened, and potentially destroyed through sufficiently extreme applications of will and technique. The battle with Nihilus revealed the true scope of what Kreia had been working to achieve throughout her years of planning and preparation. The exile's unique nature as someone who existed outside the Force made them the perfect weapon against a being whose power derived entirely from cosmic energy consumption. When Nihilus attempted to feed on the exile's life force, he encountered something that his abilities could not process or digest, a form of existence that was immune to his hunger because it operated according to entirely different principles. The defeat of both her former apprentices cleared the way for Kreia to reveal her true identity and ultimate purpose to the exile and their companions. The facade of the harmless old woman fell away, replaced by the full presence of someone whose understanding of the Force and its influence over galactic civilization had evolved far beyond traditional categories of Jedi or Sith philosophy. Her explanation of the plan she had spent decades developing challenged every assumption that her listeners held about the nature of reality itself. The Force, she revealed, was not a benevolent guide or even a neutral tool, but a form of cosmic tyranny that reduced all conscious beings to puppets dancing to the rhythm of its will. The evidence for this interpretation was all around them on Malachor V, where the planet's traumatic history continued to influence the thoughts and behaviors of visitors thousands of years after the original events had occurred. The plan required the exile to make an ultimate sacrifice, using their unique nature to create a disruption in the Force that would free every other conscious being in the galaxy from cosmic manipulation while likely destroying themselves in the process. This was not a choice that Kreia could make for them, as her entire philosophy was based on the principle that true freedom required individuals to accept responsibility for their own decisions and their consequences. The moral complexity of this choice reflected everything that Kreia had learned about the nature of teaching, manipulation, and the development of authentic independence. She could present the exile with information and arguments, she could create circumstances that clarified the stakes involved, but she could not force them to accept her vision without contradicting the very principles that made that vision worth pursuing. The debate that followed revealed how thoroughly the exile had internalized the lessons of their journey together. They questioned not just the feasibility of Kreia's plan, but its underlying assumptions about the nature of freedom, consciousness, and moral responsibility. If beings throughout the galaxy had built their civilizations, formed their relationships, and developed their values under the influence of the Force, what would happen to those achievements once that influence was removed? This challenge forced Kreia to articulate more clearly than ever before the philosophical foundations of her ultimate goal. The Force's influence, she argued, was fundamentally corrupting because it substituted cosmic guidance for individual moral development. Beings who relied on supernatural energies to make ethical choices never learned to take full responsibility for their actions, creating the conditions for the endless cycle of conflict between light and dark that had dominated galactic history. The choice facing the exile was ultimately the same one that had confronted Kreia herself decades earlier when she first began questioning Jedi orthodoxy, whether to accept comfortable illusions about the nature of reality or to pursue truth regardless of how painful or difficult that truth might prove to be. The lightsaber duel that followed was unlike any combat in the history of Force users, a battle between two beings whose understanding of power transcended traditional categories. While their methods remained fundamentally opposed, Kreia fought not merely to defend herself, but to provide one final lesson about the nature of strength, weakness, and the courage required to make choices that would reshape the galaxy's future. Every movement of her blade, every application of Force technique, was calculated to push her former student toward the realization that true victory required more than superior combat skills or supernatural abilities. The exiles' approach to the confrontation revealed how completely they had internalized the lessons learned during their journey together. Rather than relying primarily on Force powers or lightsaber techniques, they drew upon the full range of abilities developed through interaction with their diverse companions, the tactical thinking learned from Atanatan, the engineering insights gained from Bao-Durr, the spiritual wisdom shared by Visas, and the leadership skills honed through countless difficult decisions all contributed to a fighting style that integrated multiple forms of knowledge and experience. Kreia recognized in this integration the vindication of everything she had hoped to achieve through her alternative approach to education and development. The exile had become someone who could function effectively without being limited by the artificial boundaries that separated different schools of thought or traditions of training. They represented the possibility of conscious beings who could access their full potential without being constrained by the limitations imposed by cosmic forces beyond their understanding or control. As the battle progressed, Kreia began revealing prophecies and insights about the futures that awaited each of the exile's companions, not as predictions based on Force visions, but as logical extrapolations from their current development and the choices they had made during their shared journey. These revelations served as both distraction and education, showing how the influence of one remarkable individual could ripple outward to affect countless other lives in ways that no traditional Jedi or Sith training could have anticipated. Aton's potential future as a Jedi who could bridge the gap between light and dark philosophies reflected his unique background and the redemption he had achieved through exposure to genuine moral leadership. His experiences as a Sith assassin had given him insights into the psychology of Force users that could prove invaluable for preventing future conflicts between different factions. His development under the exile's influence demonstrated that true redemption required not just forgiveness for past actions, but the transformation of those experiences into wisdom that could benefit others. Visas represented the possibility of her entire species evolving beyond their traditional dependence on foresight to develop new forms of perception and understanding. Her journey from Nihilus's apprentice to the exile's companion had shown that even beings whose entire culture was built around cosmic energy could learn to see beyond the limitations of that perspective. Her future role as a teacher and guide for other Miraluka could help them transcend the vulnerabilities that had made them susceptible to manipulation by Force users like her former master. Bao-Durr's destiny lay in the development of technologies that could enhance rather than replace the natural capabilities of conscious beings. His guilt over creating the mass shadow generator had motivated him to seek ways of using his engineering skills for construction rather than destruction. The devices he would eventually create could help ordinary beings achieve things that had previously required force sensitivity, democratizing access to capabilities that had been monopolized by a tiny elite. Each of these potential futures depended on choices that the individuals involved would make independently, without coercion or manipulation from external authorities. This principle of autonomous moral development was central to Kreia's philosophy and represented what she believed could be achieved on a galactic scale if beings were freed from the subtle but pervasive influence of cosmic energies that shaped their thoughts and decisions. The final phase of their confrontation took place not in physical combat, but in the realm of ideas and philosophical argument. Kreia presented her ultimate case for why the Force must be destroyed, drawing upon everything she had learned during decades of study, teaching, and direct experience with the consequences of cosmic manipulation. Her arguments were not abstract theoretical constructs, but practical observations based on careful analysis of how Force influence had shaped galactic history and individual psychology. The exiles' responses revealed the depth of their own understanding and the authenticity of their moral development. They challenged not just specific aspects of Kreia's plan, but the fundamental assumptions underlying her entire worldview. Their questions forced her to acknowledge uncertainties and potential negative consequences that she had perhaps minimized in her determination to achieve what she saw as necessary liberation for all conscious beings. This intellectual combat was more intense and meaningful than any lightsaber duel could have been, representing the culmination of a teacher-student relationship that had evolved far beyond traditional boundaries. Both participants were simultaneously educator and learner, challenger and supporter, opponent and ally in the pursuit of truth that transcended personal victory or defeat. The resolution came not through the defeat of one combatant by another, but through mutual recognition that their conflict represented different valid responses to the same fundamental problem. Kreia acknowledged that her student had achieved something she herself had never managed, the development of authentic independence without the complete rejection of all external influence or guidance. The exile had learned to distinguish between cosmic manipulation and genuine wisdom, accepting helpful insights while maintaining ultimate responsibility for their own choices. The exile's decision regarding Kreia's ultimate plan reflected this sophisticated understanding of freedom and responsibility. Rather than simply accepting or rejecting her vision wholesale, they chose to implement it in a modified form that preserved the possibility of cosmic connection while eliminating the more coercive aspects of Force influence. This compromise represented a synthesis of their different philosophical positions that neither could have achieved independently. Kreia's acceptance of defeat was itself a form of victory, demonstrating that her teaching methods had succeeded in creating a student who could surpass their master's understanding and develop solutions that transcended the limitations of previous approaches. Her willingness to have her life's work modified and improved by someone else reflected the authentic humility that had always underlain her apparent arrogance and desire for control. Her final moments were spent not in regret or recrimination, but in satisfaction at having contributed to the development of someone capable of making the difficult choices that would shape the galaxy's future. The exile had become living proof that her vision of liberated consciousness was achievable, even if the specific methods for achieving that liberation needed to be different from what she had originally envisioned. The wisdom she shared in those last moments summarized everything she had learned about the nature of teaching, learning, and the development of authentic moral character. True education, she revealed, was not about providing correct answers, but about developing the capacity to ask better questions. Real strength came not from the accumulation of power, but from the willingness to use that power responsibly, even when doing so required personal sacrifice. Her death represented not the failure of her philosophy, but its ultimate vindication, demonstrating that even someone who had sought to transcend all limitations could find meaning and satisfaction in contributing to something greater than their individual ambitions. The echo she created through her final sacrifice would indeed ripple throughout the Force, but in ways that enhanced rather than eliminated the possibility of authentic connection between conscious beings. The transformation she had sought for the galaxy would continue through the choices made by those she had influenced, particularly the exile, whose unique nature and developed wisdom would guide them in reshaping galactic civilization according to principles that honored both individual autonomy and collective responsibility. The silence that followed Kreia's final breath was unlike anything the ancient chambers of Malachor V had ever witnessed. For thousands of years, the planet had resonated with the echoes of violence, trauma, and the consuming hunger of dark side energies that fed on pain and conflict. Now, in the aftermath of her ultimate sacrifice, a different kind of resonance began to spread outward from the Academy's deepest chambers, carrying with it the possibility of transformation that she had spent her lifetime working to achieve. The exiles stood amid the remnants of their final confrontation, feeling the subtle but profound changes that were already beginning to ripple through the cosmic energy field that connected all living things. Kreia's death had not eliminated the Force as she had originally envisioned, but it had fundamentally altered the nature of that connection in ways that would only become apparent over generations of time. The manipulation and coercion that had characterized so much of galactic history were giving way to something more respectful of individual autonomy and conscious choice. The companions who had shared the journey aboard the Ebon Hawk each felt these changes according to their own nature and sensitivity. Aton experienced a clarity of purpose that had eluded him throughout his troubled past, recognizing for the first time that his skills in reading and understanding people could be used to help rather than harm. The techniques he had learned for psychological manipulation during his years as a Sith assassin were being transformed into tools for healing and reconciliation. These found her Force sight evolving beyond its traditional limitations, allowing her to perceive not just the cosmic energies that flowed through all things, but the authentic essence of each individual consciousness she encountered. Her species had always been vulnerable to those who could manipulate Force perceptions, but now she could see beyond such deceptions to the truth that lay beneath surface appearances and artificial influences. Dantooine felt the burden of guilt that had weighed upon him since the activation of the mass shadow generator finally beginning to lift, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and possibility. His understanding of technology and its relationship to conscious beings had been enriched by everything he had witnessed during their shared adventures. The devices he would create in the years to come would serve to enhance natural capabilities rather than replace them, helping ordinary beings achieve extraordinary things through their own efforts and determination. The crystal caves beneath the Academy began to resonate with harmonies that had been absent since before the planet's traumatic history transformed it into a nexus of dark side energy. The living stones that had once amplified pain and anger now seemed capable of enhancing more positive emotions like hope, compassion, and the quiet satisfaction that came from meaningful work accomplished with integrity and skill. As the exile made their way through the Academy's corridors one final time, they reflected on the profound education they had received through their relationship with the woman who had called herself Kreia. Every lesson had been delivered through experience rather than abstract instruction. Every insight earned through the resolution of genuine moral dilemmas rather than theoretical discussion. The wisdom gained was not something that could be easily communicated to others, but had to be lived and demonstrated through choices made in service of principles that transcended personal advantage or comfort. The ship that would carry them away from Malachor V represented more than simple transportation from one world to another. It symbolized the continuation of a journey that had begun years earlier when they first chose to act according to conscience rather than convenience, when they decided to take responsibility for the consequences of their actions rather than hiding behind the authority of institutions or the guidance of cosmic forces beyond their understanding. The galaxy they were returning to would be subtly but significantly different from the one they had left. The changes initiated by Kreia's final sacrifice would take time to manifest fully, but the seeds of transformation had been planted in the choices made by countless individuals who would find themselves slightly more capable of independent thought and authentic moral reasoning than had been possible under the previous regime of cosmic manipulation. Worlds that had been devastated by the conflicts between Jedi and Sith would begin to rebuild according to principles developed by their own inhabitants rather than imposed by external authorities. Cultures that had been suppressed or marginalized during the long dominance of force-using elites would find space to flourish and contribute their own insights to galactic civilization. Technologies that enhanced natural capabilities rather than creating new dependencies would gradually replace systems designed to concentrate power in the hands of a gifted few. The academic institutions that would eventually replace the Jedi academies and Sith training centers would emphasize critical thinking, moral reasoning, and practical skills, rather than the development of supernatural abilities that isolated students from the experiences of ordinary beings. Teachers would be evaluated not on their mastery of cosmic energies, but on their ability to help students discover and develop their own authentic potential. The political structures that governed relationships between different worlds and species would evolve toward greater respect for local autonomy and cultural diversity, reducing the tendency toward galactic empires that imposed uniform standards on vastly different populations. The conflicts that had consumed so much energy and caused so much suffering throughout recorded history would gradually give way to more constructive forms of competition and collaboration. These transformations would not occur without challenges and setbacks, as the habits of thought and behavior developed over millennia of cosmic manipulation would not disappear overnight. But the foundation had been laid for a different kind of galactic civilization, one based on principles that honored both individual dignity and collective responsibility. The exile's role in this emerging order would be that of a quiet catalyst, someone whose example demonstrated that it was possible to act with wisdom and compassion without being guided by supernatural forces or constrained by traditional authorities. Their influence would spread not through the accumulation of followers or the establishment of new institutions, but through the inspiration provided by a life lived according to authentic principles. As their ship departed, Malachor V's gravitational field and entered hyperspace, the planet itself began the slow process of healing that Kreia had made possible through her ultimate sacrifice. The dark side energies that had poisoned its atmosphere for so long were gradually being neutralized by the echo she had created, replaced by the kind of natural balance that allowed life to flourish without artificial enhancement or supernatural intervention. The stars that had witnessed so much conflict and suffering throughout galactic history now looked down upon worlds where beings were learning to make choices based on reason, compassion, and genuine concern for the welfare of others rather than fear, anger, or the pursuit of power over cosmic forces. The eternal struggle between light and dark that had defined so much of recorded history was giving way to something more nuanced and ultimately more satisfying: the ongoing effort to understand and resolve the moral complexities that characterized conscious existence. In the quiet moments before sleep, beings throughout the galaxy would find themselves dreaming not of cosmic battles between supernatural forces, but of the simple satisfactions that came from work well done, relationships built on mutual respect and affection, and the gradual improvement of conditions for all who shared their worlds. These dreams would prove more powerful than any prophecy or vision, shaping the choices that would create the future Kreia had glimpsed in her moments of deepest insight and greatest hope.